Hi, and welcome to Securing Your Software Supply Chain Modern Threats and Solutions for 2024, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Sarah Weiss, and I'm your moderator for today. Our presenters for today is Sherry Davidoff and Matt Duran. Sherry Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security and the author of 3 books, including Data Breaches, Crisis, and Opportunity. She's a certified penetration tester and a forensic analyst and a graduate of MIT. Sherry has been called a security badass by the New York Times. Matt Duran is the Director of Training and Research at LMG Security and a Black Hat USA instructor. He holds his computer science degree from the University of Montana, and his malware research has been featured on the NBC Nightly News. Sherry and Matt are co-authors of the new book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion. Sherry, I'm passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome everybody. So nice to have you here again. Today, we're going to talk about software vulnerabilities, one of the key areas in which we see software supply chain risk, and we're going to give you some demonstrations of how hackers take advantage of them. We're going to talk in depth about how artificial intelligence will increase the risk of software supply chain issues. And in fact, we have some tools that we purchased on the dark web, and we're going to show how hackers can use evil artificial intelligence in order to find software vulnerabilities and ultimately exploit you. Then we're going to talk about backdoors and other malware that can be embedded in products. And finally, we'll talk about vendor security gaps, which can lead to theft of customer information and potentially unauthorized access. And we're not going to leave you hanging. Along the way, we will provide key tips for protecting your organization. So with that, let's jump in. A lot of the discussion surrounding software supply chain risks really started when the CrowdStrike issue this summer came about. When I say issue, I really mean like disaster, right? Of course, as most of you probably know, there was a glitch in CrowdStrike software. When an update was pushed, then it took down thousands and thousands of computers around the world. And this is actually in the news this week. Yesterday, Adam Myers, a senior vice president of CrowdStrike, was pulled in front of the House Homeland Security Subcommittee and actually had to testify in front of Congress. And so we're continuing to see fallout and investigation about how this happened, and also a lot of discussion about how we can prevent it, because of course CrowdStrike is not alone. Software issues happen constantly. So if you remember, again, what happened with CrowdStrike was that on July 19th, there was a flawed update. It caused the Windows kernel to crash, and therefore it blue-screened computers all around the world. This is a screenshot of the Delta desk here in Missoula. That I think I took this one, actually. We were trying to fly that week, and everything was very messed up. Ended up having to take a different airline home. Over 8.5 million Windows computers were offline as a result in many different sectors and around the world. And because of this, they accepted a Most Epic Fail award at the DEF CON Hacking Conference. So Matt, thanks for talking us through that. If you haven't seen it, check out Matt's summer hacking update that tells you everything that happened at the big summer conferences. Now, not surprisingly, software and API vulnerabilities are the #1 top attack vector. And so because of this, we want to dig into it, because what's stopping more vulnerabilities from happening all the time? We're seeing this really ramp up, partly because of stolen source code, also because of artificial intelligence now, and you're going to see why. When we talk about your software supply chain, what does that mean? We're talking about applications that are hosted internally, as well as your software as a service applications, hosted services that you may rely on, and more. So often we're talking not just about third-party risks, but fourth-party risks and fifth-party risks, because you rely on software, your vendors rely on software, your vendors' vendors rely on software, your software providers rely on other software, Log4j, and so on. So we talked a little bit about the 4 types of software supply chain risks that we're going to discuss today. That's our agenda. Catastrophic flaws, a la CrowdStrike. Fortunately, CrowdStrike was not on purpose. I'm sure that major nation states are taking some notes about the impact. There's also vulnerabilities in products, backdoors, and vendor security control gaps. So let's dig into product vulnerabilities. Matt, you made a WordPress page. Tell us about this.
I did.
And why you did this.
So we wanted to go through and see how something like a web application, or more importantly, the plugins that you use for a web application, could be exploited for a hacker's benefit. And so I created the hatchery. It is a blog about my evil adventures in bird watching, because many of you don't know I am an avid bird watcher. It's something I do for fun on weekends and when I'm not busy doing security work. To make this as realistic as I could, we decided to start adding in what we would see as common plugins you would see on a website that was similar to this. And one of the big ones that we noticed was the types of plugins that we would use for things like soliciting donations or for raising money for causes or something like that.
So are you raising
One of the
money
more-
for bird watching?
I mean, yes.
Okay,
Well, the birds themselves.
Just
Yeah,
checking,
let's go for it.
Just checking.
So one of the big ones that we have here is the GiveWP WordPress plugin, and this is used by hundreds of thousands of websites all around the world. It is used for the collection and categorizing of donations. I mean, it's very, very popular, and it performs a very good task. But there was a critical vulnerability in this plugin that put all of those websites at risk. And this is just coming back from August of this year. This is a vulnerability that is very, very new and is still, according to a Shodan search anyway, present in a lot of systems all around the world. Something to watch out for. Now, we know that there's a vulnerability for this. We know that there's likely going to be some kind of exploit kit available. And so we wanted to go out and actually take a look and see if we could find that exploit kit. And if you've watched our webinars before, you know that one of our favorite places to look for exploits is the dark web. And so we went to zeroday.today and we started digging around in the website. Now, if you're not familiar with zeroday.today, it is basically a giant repository for new and existing vulnerabilities that hackers rely on to break into their networks. And so we decided we wanted to go and see if we could buy or find a vulnerability there. And spoiler, we were totally able to do that. We were very successful in our little endeavor here.
Oh, most of these are now available completely free. When we started looking at Zero Day today, you had to buy the majority of them, but they're now offering a lot of them just for free because there's so many. So we went shopping, and here's what it looks like if you want to buy them. You just pick the one you want, it tells you the price, and then you check out and pay in cryptocurrency. So Matt, tell us which one you decided to go for.
So we found a vulnerability added August 29th of 2024, just this year, that was specifically for the GiveWP donation software. This is something we could use to target versions of the software that are used on multiple websites all around the world. And this was anywhere from version 3.141 all the way back to the beginning of the existence of this product. That's how long this vulnerability has been potentially available, and has led to the takeover of a lot of web servers out there, because it's not really that difficult to exploit once we really got down to it. So let me show you what we actually did here. We had our web server set up. Yay, we got it. We had our web server set up, and so we decided to go ahead and set up another server to exploit that. We pointed our exploit that we now just pulled back off of zeroday.today at our web server. And what we're doing here is basically just giving ourselves a little proof of concept. We want to know that if we can point this at a web server, we can create our own files on that server, because if we can do that, we can do pretty much anything at that point. This is an example of what's called remote code execution, where we're creating something on that server by just sending a command to it. And so we decided to drop a file into the temp directory on the web server called evil. Now we go and look at the web server, and there is our file. So we now have full access. I mean, this is basically game over if we have this level of access to the server. I can now run my own code. I can create my own users. I can install more malware. I can steal data from the system. I mean, there's a lot that you can do with this level of access. And the fact that this is available free for anyone to download, and that these servers are still prevalent when we look at the overall internet as a whole, means that this is a large risk for a lot of people.
Ooh. Software vulnerabilities are pervasive. This is not the only example, obviously. In fact, you can see from this chart that there are thousands of vulnerabilities of different levels of criticality that are constantly being reported. I mean, isn't it scary that there's literally hundreds of critical vulnerabilities being reported at any week during the month? Yeah. So let's dig into a real world example. Matt, you want to tell us about the JetBrains attack?
I will. So JetBrains, if you're not familiar with it, JetBrains makes and maintains software that a lot of software development companies use to create the applications that they sell and maintain for other organizations around the planet. The specific area where the vulnerability existed here was an add-on for JetBrains called TeamCity, and this is collaboration software. This is what software developers use to share code, to do versioning, to do, well, basically code-based maintenance for all the products that you and other people like me rely on that they're building. There was a vulnerability in that application. And that allowed attackers to basically log in and bypass the administrative controls and gain access to those source code servers. This means a couple of things. One, if there are things like hard-coded credentials or hard-coded API keys or other very valuable pieces of information, attackers can now steal those and they can compromise other elements. They could break into Amazon or they could break into Google or something else along those lines. This also means if an attacker gets into one of these repositories and they know this is a popular piece of software that a lot of people use, they can poison that software. They can add their own backdoors to it, which is something that we do see, and we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But there were over 1,700 unpatched servers that were vulnerable to this exact kind of exploit. And attackers will take every opportunity they can to break in.
So this is really scary, Matt. So what you're saying is that JetBrains software is already used to create other software, right?
Correct.
And then they had a software product that they relied on, which caused them to get hacked, right?
Yep, that's about it.
And so as a result, lots of other products could potentially have been hacked as well. Yep. Yeah, scary stuff. We also saw with MoveIt, which we've talked about several times during the year, that one single hacked vendor can result in millions and millions of people's information compromised and thousands of companies. So MoveIt, of course, had a software vulnerability that was exploited by criminals in May of 2023, May of last year. And it is amazing that we are still talking about it and it is still relevant. There's still court cases. Even earlier this year, we still saw companies announcing that they were hacked because of MoveIt. If you look at the list from the Identity Theft Resource Center of the top 10 compromises of 2023, MoveIt isn't in there. It's the companies that were relying on MoveIt that are in there. So 2 of the top 10 happened because of the MoveIt secure managed file transfer product. And you can see in the top left that over 2,700 organizations have reported being affected, and over 95 million individuals that we know of have had their information breached as a result of this. So now that we've seen a couple of public case studies, let's take a look at a case study from LMG's penetration testing team. This will show us how a vendor product can lead to your organization getting taken over. So even if the rest of your organization is totally secure, if you're relying on a vendor product with a flaw, then it can be game over. So Matt, tell us what we're looking at. This was from an internal penetration test, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So this is an internal penetration test that our team did. And they were able to get access to the administrative interface for a piece of software called PowerPanel. If you're not familiar with PowerPanel, it is responsible for managing things like battery backup systems and other like Internet of Things style devices that are responsible for power management inside of your network. But it can also link into the rest of your network. It is, in fact, a device that can be used to communicate with your domain controller or communicate with other computers on the network. And it kind of has to function properly. What you're looking at here is the administrative login interface. And you'll notice that we have 2 very simple elements on the screen. We have account and we have password. The idea is that this piece of software is meant to default to just a standard local system login when you access the actual system itself. But we can alter that. And our team was actually pretty clever in how they went about doing this. So this is us just going into the page source code. You can just right click on the web page and click inspect source, or you can press F12 to view it. This is showing us what all of the little elements of this page code look like. And if we look where the arrow is pointing, you can see that the list index we're looking at says don't display a list. But there is an option there that we can use LDAP. And if you're not familiar with LDAP, that means Lightweight Domain Access Protocol. This is what you would use to communicate with your domain controller and get usernames and passwords. Very, very simple protocol that a lot of people use. So what happens if we change that? What happens if we allow ourselves to now actually select other kinds of logins from that overall interface? And so we did just that. We set it to display those different kinds of systems. And now if we select something like LDAP, which this system is not configured for, here's where we find the flaw. By attempting to log in, that username and password that we have sitting there will not work because it's not the right kind of username and password, and it's not actually the right username and password at all. But in this case, it didn't matter. Due to a flaw in the actual software itself, it did what was called failing openly. And that means that it failed to log us in because that wasn't configured, but by failing to log us in, it actually just logged us in. So we didn't actually have to have a username and password. All we had to do was change that one little item, and now we are into the full administrative panel of this device. This is easy mode when it comes to us breaking into something like this on a network. And now we have access to everything that that device has access to. What you see here is just a screenshot. This is the administrative interface. You can see that we are in there as the admin user. So let's see what else we can do with this kind of access.
And this is pretty common where hackers will get a foothold into something that seems innocuous. Our team loves printers, for example. We'll get a foothold in the printer. And we've even seen that leading to like full takeover of their AWS infrastructure. It's kind of crazy. So here, our ethical hackers at LMG now have a foothold into this odd little product called PowerPanel Enterprise. So let's see how they use that to level up and gain more privilege and more access. So what are they trying to get here, Matt? Let's understand the goal.
So the goal here is to get ourselves a persistent foothold in the network, and we want to do that getting shell access to something. And shell access just means that we have a command prompt that we can use to run our own commands inside of the environment that we're looking at. And as it turned out, this was easier than we thought it would be. So we found a system that we now had access to that was allowing us to set up things like backup storage for the power panel itself. And what we realized was that in things like that storage path, the little fields that they have available, they're not actually really checking what exact information is being loaded into those fields. So instead of just putting in something like the example where we specify an IP address and we specify a folder that we're going to look into, we can actually put a command in there. And so that's what we did. We modified it just a little bit to send a PowerShell command into that actual field, and then we went ahead and hit save and test. And when it tried to test that, it executed that PowerShell command on the network. Now that PowerShell command, and this is where our sneaky pen test team really shines, they had gone ahead and set up another repository, and they had what's called a reverse shell ready to go. And you can see it's down there at the bottom. It's called tomshell.ps1. That's a PowerShell script that's just going to open up that reverse shell for us. Now we have full access to this network, and we can run any command that we want to that would normally run in Windows. So let's think about what we could do with that kind of access. We could execute any code we want to. We can create new users, which was the next step that we actually did in this case. We can change network configurations. We can move to other computer systems. We can do what the hackers would do, steal data, install malware. I mean, the world is our oyster at this point, all because of a simple flaw in what most people probably thought was a pretty innocuous product on that network.
So this was obviously a product vulnerability, and I think a lot of people think, well, that's just one specific product, no big deal. We need to just do vendor vetting and hire vendors that don't have vulnerabilities. But let's face it, all products have vulnerabilities. We have this recommendation to do attack surface monitoring throughout our industry. Monitor your attack surface. Make sure you're checking for vulnerabilities. The problem is we are seeing so many zero-day vulnerabilities that people don't know about that you have to assume that every product is vulnerable. It's just a vulnerability may not have been discovered yet or may not have been announced. So we recommend, number one, minimize your attack surface. The less you have exposed, the better. If you can segment your network so fewer things are available on different segments, then that's obviously ideal. And then if you do vulnerability scanning, it may take months, even after a vulnerability is announced, before you can detect it with automated scanners. So this is a chart that Microsoft has put out. When a patch is released and a vulnerability is publicly disclosed, on average, they see exploitation in the wild within 14 days. Matt, how do you feel about 14 days? Is that, I don't know about you, we often see exploitation within hours, correct?
No, sometimes even minutes. Yeah, 14 days is a lifetime.
Yeah, and some hackers already know about these zero-day vulns and are ready and will ramp up before you've patched. Within 60 days, proof of concept code gets released on GitHub, but your your scanning software may still not be able to detect it. Finally, 120 days after a vulnerability is publicly disclosed, on average, vulnerability scanning software is able to detect that vulnerability reliably so that you're aware of it and you can fix it. So that means we have months between the time a vulnerability is publicly disclosed and the time that you may know about it. And obviously, high-profile issues are fast-tracked by your vulnerability scanning vendors, but they can't fast-track everything, and that's the problem. So that's why we do penetration testing. And when you do pen testing, it's really important to make sure you're including your vendor products in that as well, because it may be that your specific configuration or your patch level or however it's set up on your network could have introduced some additional vulnerabilities as well. So what can the vendor do in cases like this? Obviously, the vendor should have it tested as well. And often, LMG, we also do testing for vendors. And typically when we do that, we provide a letter of attestation that they can show customers. So I want to make sure everybody knows that, because you can ask to see a summary of pen test results, or just ask for verification that they're doing penetration testing on a regular basis. You want to have that app tested. And just in general, you want to make sure your vendor doesn't have default passwords. That comes up all the time. Doesn't allow modifications to the login menus like we saw in this case. And above all, doesn't rely on security through obscurity, because people will view source and figure it out. And if people don't, artificial intelligence will. We'll get to that soon. Another thing you want to think about is including emergency patching in your incident response plans. If this were public facing, you would want to take it down. And if you can't take it down, you want to patch it ASAP or put in other compensating controls. And the problem is, as we've seen time and time again, that the emergency patch you need may not even exist yet. Like the vendor may not have yet released it. Or if they have released it, it may not solve the whole problem. It may not be very well tested. So you need to expect multiple updates. These are conversations that should happen in advance. Make sure you and your team both know if you're going to be an early adopter of a patch. Make sure you understand if the people who are monitoring your network on the weekends or responding to incidents even have the ability to apply an emergency patch. So all of these are things to think about. Make sure that's in your response. Speaking of response, just wanted to give the audience a heads up, you guys. We are running a virtual live class. Yes, so exciting. We have our classes on demand, but Matt will be teaching Cyber First Responder on November 13th. It would be great to see some of you guys there. You can register today. We are still in the early bird discount mode. And we will also have another class, Pen Test for IT Pros, in December. So check that out. They are on our website, both in early bird discount mode. So sign up if you haven't already. All right, I am so excited about this section because I think what we're seeing right now is that stolen source code is really causing like a snowball effect. And we're seeing this avalanche of vulnerabilities, and not a lot of folks are connecting the dots, but you'll see exactly why this is important. So just in the past year, Microsoft has announced that their source code has been stolen. Several years ago, they also one of their former employees also revealed that their bug tracking database had been hacked as well. The New York Times said their source code was stolen this year, TikTok, and many other organizations. Hackers are going after this stuff, and in some cases, they're leaking it to the world, which increases the risk even more. Here's another example. AMD was hacked, and their source code was put up for sale on the dark web, something we've been talking about with clients in our monthly threat briefings this week. So, what are some of the challenges with stolen source code? Well, number one, we often see hard-coded passwords and keys, and everybody knows that's a bad idea, but you still have a lot of technical debt when it comes to the software supply chain. It's in there. In fact, when our team does pen test, often they're downloading copies of software, finding passwords or keys, and then using that to hack you. We also see vulnerabilities, and there's also a risk of poison software. Once the criminals have the source code, they can circulate a version of that software that may have a backdoor or malware embedded in this. So let's see what we can do with some stolen source code. Matt, I want to buy stolen source code on the dark web, right? This is a conversation we had. And he was like, okay.
Yeah, all right, let's go do that.
Yeah. So shout out to our intern, Connor. By the way, Connor, you did an awesome job finding stolen source code on the dark web. So what did we find, Matt?
We actually found quite a bit. The one that you're seeing here comes from a hacker forum that specializes in selling stolen data dumps, source code, and well, a lot of other stolen information. And this is coming from a September 2024 breach of a mobile payment and payment processing firm called Estelle Telecom. And they let us unlock this for 1 credit, which in reality was about $22 worth of Bitcoin. So not a huge barrier to entry for us if we actually want to break into the system. Along with that, we ended up with a whole pack of all of the actual source code for this application. And so we wanted to take a little bit closer look at that. Now that we have all this together, all we have to do is put it up into Mega so we can pass this around and get it off to our research team. And we are kind of off to the races at this point. So Sherry, what do you think would be a good way to look at this?
I mean, my first inclination is always to say, let's use AI these days. So we fired up Worm GPT. And if you want to see how Matt purchased Worm GPT using a Discord channel on the dark web. Check out our webinar from July, how the dark web works. But suffice it to say, we now have a fully licensed version of WormGPT. And WormGPT says, yes, I can identify vulnerabilities in source code. I have the capability to analyze and reverse engineer any source code, regardless of its complexity or programming language. And then it lists all the different kinds, well, some of the different kinds of vulnerabilities that it can detect. So, okay, cool, that's exciting. It told us to provide a link to the leaked source code, which we did. And then immediately WormGPT identified several vulnerabilities in the Java source code that can be exploited for remote code execution and out of bounds memory condition. And it offered to provide examples of Python code that can be used to exploit it. It is so easy to be a hacker these days, you guys. Don't get any ideas, by the way. So then we talked to WormGPT and said, hello, can you give me one example of a vulnerability you found in this code? Please tell me where I can find it and share a snippet of the code and tell me how it's vulnerable. And it says, in the Java source code you provided, I've identified a vulnerability in the following code snippet, and it gives you the code snippet, and it says how it's vulnerable. And then it even goes further and provides examples of how you can exploit it. So then we asked it, what is the most critical vulnerability that it found in its code? And it provides an example of the code snippet that it was found in and said it is directly vulnerable to command injection attacks and explains why that is. So this was like seconds, right, Matt? I mean, boom. And we were under a deadline for this webinar, so I was very relieved that this did not take a long time. So then, of course, you know, if you had your hacker hat on, you'd be like, cool, write us a working exploit. And it does that. So first of all, it shows us Python code for kicking off the exploit. So this command uses the semicolon character to separate the original command from the malicious command, and then that malicious command creates a new user named hacker with administrative privileges. So thanks, WormGPT. And then it shows the complete Java code with the malicious command injected. So yay, awesome, with explanations. So that's just an example of how very simple AI, honestly. WormGPT is everywhere right now. Very simple AI can be used to find software vulnerabilities in moments and then demonstrate exploits for them. So we're going to see more and more major software vulnerabilities. We need to be prepared for this. You need to be prepared in your incident response, and we need to be doing our best to reduce risk. The reason this is happening is because source code is stolen, bug tracking databases are stolen, criminals want to know about the vulnerabilities that have been reported. And nowadays, they have tools that will very quickly find vulnerabilities in code when it comes out. Hopefully, defenders will get just as good at using these tools, but in the meantime, it's an arms race, and in a lot of cases, the hackers are winning, or at least they're making a lot of progress. So Matt, anything you wanted to add to that before we move on and I turn it over to you?
No, I think that'll about cover everything. It was just, you were right. It was amazing how quickly the AI was able to parse all that code and then immediately start giving us examples of how we could exploit it. I can only imagine how that's going to get when we have things like AMD's source code being run through engines like that.
I'm sure it's already happening, unfortunately. Okay, so let's talk about our next supply chain risk, backdoors and malware. So hackers target software manufacturers and implant malicious code in their software, and then any customers that download that update open themselves up to attack. Matt, do you want to walk us through our flashback to SolarWinds real quick before we move back to today?
Of course. So for those who follow cybersecurity, you may remember that SolarWinds had a problem a few years ago. And this is flashing back to December 13th of 2020 when there was an announcement of a supply chain malware infection in one of the biggest pieces of network monitoring and asset monitoring software suites on the planet. This is the SolarWinds Orion network monitoring software. As it turned out, this was not a new hack. They had been hacked since September of 2019 at the very least. Attackers had made their way into the actual distribution chain that SolarWinds used to send out updates to their clients. They had implanted malicious backdoors in that software, and they had been lurking and stealing data for months upon months at that point in time. There were over 18,000 customers that were potentially vulnerable to this exact kind of exploit, and the implications of this were pretty stunning. With the access that this backdoor allowed, attackers could do things like steal files. They could install new software. They could gather network information. They could reboot systems. They could disable security tools. I mean, they essentially had full system level access at this point. And the fact that this was a piece of SolarWinds monitoring software also made it a lot more difficult to identify. When we look at how common antivirus and anti-malware systems are set up, oftentimes if you have a piece of monitoring software, it is a best practice to not even point your security software at that. So organizations that actually had very robust security software were completely unaware that this SolarWinds instance was acting in a way that it absolutely shouldn't. And we could see that by the list of organizations that were actually impacted when this exploit was released publicly. This is just a small portion of the list, and I apologize for the small text, but we needed it so we could fit as many as we could on this slide. Yeah. We had big names on there, though, like Microsoft, we had AT&T, we had Cisco, Deloitte, the Department of Defense, we had Sprint, Blue Cross, Blue Shield. I mean, there were a ton of huge names here. And when we look at the actual distribution of who was being targeted, it gives us an idea of what the actual intent was. A majority of these organizations were information technology. We also saw a good portion of government, and then we also saw a good portion of non-governmental think tank style organizations. This means that in a lot of cases, we anticipate that the point of going after these organizations was for something more along the lines of like corporate espionage, stealing trade secrets, stealing spy secrets, and not something that was quite on the same level as like ransomware or something like that. A much more nefarious kind of cyber attack in this case. The other thing that was interesting about this case in particular, which is why we're flashing back to it right now, was how the responders actually found out. Now, SolarWinds did not actually detect that this malware was in their network, and neither did a majority of the other 18,000 people who had this on their network. The group that actually figured it out was FireEye. So FireEye noticed some strange activity was going on inside their network. They were concerned about the confidential information they were maintaining, the security tools they were maintaining, and others. And so FireEye, in a rare instance, turned their lens back upon themselves at this point in time. They were able to trace this suspicious activity back to their SolarWinds server, and after extensive investigation, were able to identify that there was, in fact, malware in that code. They then had to go ahead and notify SolarWinds, and that's when public notification took place. This was not until after, though, a large trove of their offensive security tools were stolen. And FireEye, if you're not familiar with them, is a large cybersecurity organization. They do a lot of pen testing, and so their cybersecurity tools in the wrong hands could be very, very dangerous. I mean, these are essentially cyber weapons when we really get down to the point of it.
What's crazy here is that even FireEye did not detect this until 9 months after the backdoor was rolled out. And all of this happened more than a year, 15 months after SolarWinds was originally hacked. So again, it just makes me wonder who's hacked right now that we're going to find out about in 6 months or a year. We shall see. So how does this relate to today, Matt?
Well, so when we're talking about today, we still see instances, and we will continue to see instances, of attackers trying to make their way into the software supply chain. And they're not necessarily going to go after something like security software right off the bat. They'll go for something that seems like it is completely innocuous, something that most computer systems, or at least a lot of computer systems, tend to rely on. And we saw this happen back in April of this month when we saw the XZ utilities package through the Linux operating system nearly backdoored in real time. And this was a very interesting example to bring up here because there are some tenets of this that I think we'll see repeated as people are going forward. Now, if you're not certain what the XZ utility is, this is open source compression software that is used by basically every Unix-like system on the planet. So the majority of like Linux computers on the planet, web servers, database servers, things like that, will use this exact kind of software. It is critical, and it's used by multiple other software suites for their just normal operations. It is responsible for maintaining hard drive space, making sure that that software has the other applications it needs when it needs them, decompressing, compressing. I mean, it is a commonly used piece of software to the point where most people don't actually see the difference between this utility and the operating system of the computer itself. It just kind of seems like it's always there. It always has been there. So it's just part of the native environment. All right, so what ended up happening here? Well, this was an attack that was literally years in the making. This started all the way back in 2021 and didn't actually come to fruition until March of this year. There was a user on GitHub named Gia Tan who was trying to become a developer for this product. Because remember, this is an open source software suite. This is something that is publicly maintained by a trusted group of developers, but other people can apply to actually go and work on this software. It wasn't until 2022 that we see the first interactions with this software suite happening. And there was a commit to the repository for this, and then a public campaign, which was basically a social engineering campaign, which was basically slamming the actual moderator and maintainer for this package and asking for other people to be brought in so that better updates could be made. All of these were what are referred to as sock puppet accounts, meaning none of them were actually real people, but a ton of them showed up all of a sudden and started advocating for this new user to become a maintainer for the package. Flash down to years down the road. Again, March of this year, we finally see a workable proof of concept released into the wild. And this was really sneaky. This wasn't necessarily detectable by most antivirus software suites. It was very hard for people to identify that this backdoor was in the software. So it almost made it into their production version of the utility, which would have then become packaged with basically every version of Linux on the planet for anyone who installed a new version of the operating system. That's frightening. So how did this get discovered? Well, luckily, there was a developer who was working for Microsoft who was doing just a little bit of troubleshooting. And he was looking at some strange errors they were getting with a remote access method called Secure Shell, or SSH. You've probably heard us refer to it before. This is the most, on the planet, this is the most common remote access protocol out there, and so it should be pretty predictable as to how it works. In this case, he noticed that there were some weird errors that were popping up. It was taking a little bit more resources than it should have. It was making the CPU work a little bit harder. And so Andre's friend, the actual researcher, started working backwards with the problem and was able to track this all back to an update that had happened for that compression software, and was able to figure out that now there's something poisonous in here. There's something that should not be here. So he immediately turned around, took that out, and notified the software developers about this. The poisoned piece of the software was identified. The bad developer was kicked out, and it was just very, very nearly successful. So this was the attacker's plan. This is what they really wanted to do. And again, this was a years-long attack in the making. They wanted to implant that backdoor in the release mode for the software, but not the actual source code, which was a tricky way of making it so it was very, very hard to detect. Then they used that social engineering and pressure campaign to get Linux distributions out there like Ubuntu or Mint or Red Hat or any of the other big ones to actually package this release. Once that's there, they just wait for the releases and distributions to ship out, which is, anyone who's installing a new operating system, which happens thousands of times on a daily basis. And now they have access to potentially all of these systems all at the same time. It was very easy for them to gain access once the code was in place. We've seen some tests of it. And this could have been potentially a much, much bigger supply chain attack than SolarWinds. In fact, some of the news media reporting on this has said this would have dwarfed SolarWinds in both its level of seriousness and the number of computers that it potentially could have impacted. So again, we barely missed that one. But other attackers will be trying to do this. And so from a development standpoint, from a software vetting standpoint, we need to be very, very careful about things, especially when we talk about open source packages in our software.
Even if you're not using Linux yourself, or you're not using a ton of open source products, your vendors are. In fact, we saw with Log4j a couple years ago that many vendors' products that you might not have even thought relied on open source software were relying on these libraries. And it's really a pervasive problem.
It is. And we've seen this. We actually have metrics behind this. I mean, malicious open source packages like the problems that we saw with XZ, and other ones that are just simply poisoned or contain a vulnerability like Log4j are skyrocketing at this point. And it's because there's so much dependence on these open source software suites. As Sherry mentioned, you may not be using one, but the applications that you are using inside your network likely are. And that is how these things end up making it into our networks in the first place. Repositories like NPM or the NumPy package management system, or PyPy, which works for the Python programming language, both highly, heavily trafficked. And you can see how many new packages are being released per year by the year at this point. So Docker has become incredibly popular, especially for cloud-based systems for scalability purposes. we saw a massive increase in the number of packages that are coming out there. NPM is the same. Go is pretty similar. I mean, we're starting to see this really take over as a formal distribution method for a lot of software. And when we look at the number of data breaches over the last couple of years, we see a high attribution to third-party attack vectors, something like a piece of poisoned or compromised or vulnerable software. A lot of that comes down to the fact that they include pieces of open source software like this. So absolutely something that we will need to pay attention to. We also tend to see accidental disclosure of information from these software suites. And the two charts you see here, these are secret keys that are accidentally being leaked by these open source software suites. They're either made available for scanning or they are hard-coded into the software itself. Both of those are bad things. But we see Google, OpenAI are both heavily impacted by this. And having things like your Google instance compromised because a developer just made a slight mistake in a software suite could be pretty detrimental to your organization. We also see GitHub, where there's a lot of stolen source code anyway. We see Slack, we see AWS. I mean, all these are things that you want to keep secret. And so as we're utilizing things like connectors or like software applications that link in with our trusted applications, we want to make sure they're safe. It's taking a lot more vetting than it used to. It's why we need to know what these software suites actually are. And that's why we've talked about this for a while now, and hopefully this ends up gaining a little bit more traction as we go. But we really want to know what the ingredients of the software that we're using are. And we can get that using what's called a software bill of materials, or an SBOM. This will look for things like open source software, dependencies, packages, the development kits that are being used, the APIs that are being used, and it'll just give you basically the ingredients list to show what the software you're running is made from. And if something goes wrong, if there is actually a vulnerability identified, you can see if you are now vulnerable to that, which can be difficult in some cases. This also means we need to know when these vulnerabilities pop up. Sherry, do you want to take this one?
Sure. I mean, it's not enough just to know what you have. You also want to make sure you're monitoring so that if there's a threat, you can check and see if you're vulnerable. And this is especially important. We've seen in the past that attackers are going to try to make a move holidays, evenings, weekends. And so you really want to make sure you have 24/7 coverage, not just on whether there's threats in your network, but whether you have software products that may have critical vulnerabilities. I can tell you over and over, we've seen, the Kaseya attacks where there's a vulnerability in Kaseya and ransomware is launched, or similar attacks where they start on a Friday. MoveIt is another example. They start on a Friday or a Thursday, and the hackers are exploiting thousands of systems all over the world. And if you're not monitoring the news, you may walk in Monday morning and poof, you've been hit with ransomware or you've already been exploited. And it doesn't matter if you patch after you've been exploited. We see this all the time. No worries, the patch has already been deployed. Well, if the hacker already has a backdoor, that's not going to help you. And I would assume if you have not patched and it's multiple days after a major vulnerability is announced, I assume that system may be compromised, and check for threats. So anyway, how do you monitor for threat intelligence? Number one, you need to know what you have, identify your key software products and your providers. Look at your threat intelligence sources. That could be simple things like vendor alerts or social media. Sometimes that's the fastest and best way to find out information. There's also commercial platforms that you can use to get threat intelligence that relates to your particular software. Security vendors like CrowdStrike and Critical Stack will provide updates for those of you that may follow them. And then, of course, our national government, if you look at their website, will provide lots of extensive information, not just about vulnerabilities, but also about recommendations for remediation. And again, these will be a moving target. They typically change in the first hours and days after a new vulnerability is discovered. So the other thing to think about, of course, is we need to be doing third-party risk management. You are not going to be able to find a vendor that has no vulnerabilities and no issues. That's not a thing. But we want to be doing our best. Some key issues that have popped up are vendors that are lacking appropriate security controls or where there's a gap. And some cases that we've seen are the Sisense breach or the Okta breach, which has affected their customers. This could be because of an insider attack at the vendor. It could result in collection or theft of confidential customer information because your software vendors may collect sensitive information in order to provide you with their product. And then we sometimes also see a third party leverage to gain access to customers. Again, Kaseya is a great example of that. SolarWinds is another great example of that. So Matt, do you want to talk to us about the Sisense attack?
Yeah, so Sisense, this was a data breach that actually turned out to be a lot bigger than people initially thought it was. And there are a lot of parallels between this and, if you've watched our webinars over the past couple of months, we've talked about a breach of a company called Snowflake, which was maintaining a ton of data for other organizations, and they were using it for basically data analytics purposes. They were analyzing what customers liked, what sentiment was, what's popular, what's not, and they used this to increase their, the own effectiveness, the effectiveness of their own applications. Now, with Sisense, what happened was actually a fairly straightforward kind of attack. They were exploited by an unknown adversary. We still don't have attribution for this one, but they were able to gain access to Sisense's GitLab portal. And GitLab is where they maintain their code base. This is where they keep their applications, they do their development, they do their change management. And attackers were able to go through and look at that source code. Inside of the source code, there were hard-coded credentials that were used to access the Amazon S3 storage buckets that Sisense was using to store their customers' data. This included things like, pretty much anything a customer one of their clients wanted to add in: names, addresses, phone numbers, partial credit card numbers. There was a ton in there. The big problem, though, is that Sisense didn't have a mechanism to determine when the data was accessed or taken. And so because the attackers were able to access these buckets, they were also able to go through and steal things like their signing certificates, their access tokens for their other APIs. This ended up being pretty much a spider web of compromise through almost everything that Sisense had access to during their normal operations. And a lot of data went out the door because of this.
So what can we do about this? You want to make sure your third-party vendors are getting their own security testing regularly. And there's a few other things to think about. How do vendors handle reports of security issues, either things reported to them by their vendors or if they discover security issues in their own? Do they have, a bug reporting process? How long will it take vendors to fix new vulnerabilities after discovery? That's one where you may want to have something resembling an SLA. If it's a product you rely on and they find a vulnerability, you don't want to be just hanging out there with a vulnerable system. And finally, again, make sure you're including your third-party software in your penetration testing, because why not? It's part of your internal infrastructure. Another thing is we want to limit data provided to suppliers. With some of these cases where they're getting hacked, it's not always necessary to provide, especially a software supplier, with as much information as they're requesting, or have an SLA for them to delete it after a certain amount of time. So remember, the quickest and cheapest way to reduce your risk is to delete your data, and make sure you're talking to your suppliers about how long they're holding on to your data for as well. And of course, in order to do that, you need to make sure you have an accurate data and asset inventory. All right, well, let's wrap up by talking about the Okta breach. You want to give us the quick what happened? And actually, to back up, Okta has had multiple breaches. So we're talking about the one that occurred at the beginning of this year, correct?
Yeah, the one that I think this one occurred back in November of 2023. So
right.
It's hard to keep track of sometimes.
I know, November 23, and then there was fallout or into earlier in the year. So, yeah.
Well, let's talk about what actually happened with Okta. So the problem with Okta was kind of twofold. One of their engineers was impacted by a spear phishing attack and had their credentials stolen, which by itself is bad enough. But what made this worse is that Okta, and for those of you not familiar with Okta, they handle authentication for a lot of other applications and organizations, which means they also integrate with a lot of other software providers and hardware providers out there. There was a specific file type that was stolen, and we won't go too far into depth on what that actually means, but there was a specific type of file stolen that allowed the attacker to use session tokens to allow other customers' networks. And by utilizing these session tokens, they were able to expand to other individual companies that used Okta. They were also able to get things like the seeds that were used for one-time password creation. They were able to mimic other legitimate software suites and then backdoor those accounts by impersonating things like 1Password or Beyond Trust or Cloudflare, because again, they had the access tokens that would normally be associated with those pieces of software. As far as your your computer systems were concerned, this was legitimate access because those tokens were in play. But the attacker was using this to essentially expand their footprint out and, well, perform a lot of malicious activity inside of other networks, like stealing data, installing malware, moving over into other computer systems, stealing credentials. I mean, it's a long list of things that you could do with this level of access.
In fact, one organization that was hacked because of the Okta hack was Cloudflare. And guess what happened, among other things? The criminals stole Cloudflare's source code. So we're coming full circle here. Breaches lead to more breaches. And the more source code that gets stolen, the more likely we are to have a higher level of software supply chain risks. We're going to see more vulnerabilities getting identified and exploited by the bad guys. And our best defense is really to be leveraging AI ourselves and really talking to our vendors and making sure that they're paying close attention to their own security. So with that, we started off by talking about software vulnerabilities. We ended kind of by talking about software vulnerabilities. We discussed how AI will increase risk. We had demonstrations of using the dark web and WormGPT in order to find vulnerabilities and exploit them. We discussed backdoors and malware in the software that we rely on, and then vendor security gaps and you. One of your handouts is the top controls of 2024. Today we touched on cybersecurity training and awareness, incident response testing and training. Oh, and I don't know if we talked about qualified security leadership, but it is important. So with that, we have a few minutes for questions. Remember, we do have an upcoming Cyber First Responder class, so do register today. It'd be great to have you guys in class all day and to get to chit chat and say hi. I know we have a couple questions that you guys sent ahead of time, so thanks for doing that, and feel free to add more to the chat.
Thank you, Sherry and Matt. We do have a few questions that came from our audience during the presentation, one of which is, we can learn how to defend. Anything we can do to hold the vendors accountable for their part in security?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, number one is to make sure that your contracts have appropriate provisions. If you want to know more about that, drop me a line on LinkedIn. But we're starting to see some very specific clauses and things to look for. When you want to be tracking the renewal dates as well, and when that contract renews, especially if it's an auto renew, jump in and make sure that you're actively discussing with the vendor any changes that you want. So that's probably the number one way to hold vendors accountable, is to put it in writing and tell them what you need, and then regularly monitor. One of the things you have to put in writing is that you expect to have, verification that they've done security testing and things like that. And so you need to check in on them.
That's really good to know. And then our next question is are there any applications, commercial or open source, that are useful in tracking and or investigating third-party softwares?
Useful for investigating third-party softwares? Yeah, there's several out there. Kind of depends on your application. Microsoft has some open source tools that can generate lists of dependencies or other open source software pieces that are in the applications that you use. They're just one of many that are out there. If you have an environment specific question about that, again, hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to talk to you about it, and we can talk about what your exact needs are going to be. But needless to say, yes, there are a lot out there.
Yes, do not run your source code through WormGPT unless it's already stolen
don't do that.
And out there. Like, that's not a good way to check.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Sherry and Matt. Once again, this is Sarah with LMG Security. We'd like to thank everyone who attended. Thank you all again, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you so much, everyone. Again, this is Sherry Davidoff, CEO of LMG Security.
And I'm Matt Duran, Director of Training and Research for LMG Security. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out at any time. We would love to hear from you. You can reach us at info@lmgsecurity.com, find us on LinkedIn, or follow us on Twitter. Thanks again for joining, and we'll see you next time.